Welcome to Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast where we celebrate all things spooky and mental health.
I'm your host, Mark Moore.
And I am your other host, Josh Berkey.
And we're talking about James Wan's new film, *Malignant*.
Can we just start off by addressing kind of like how commercialized James Wan has become since his Saw days? Like, it's pretty incredible that in less than 20 years, this guy has kind of become this generation's like John Carpenter. But I feel like when you talk to people about James Wan, they either know Conjuring or Insidious, and they don't really know like the full scope of who he is as a filmmaker.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with the bigger the budget, the more the flash, and the more recognition they tend to get. Saw was just essentially an experiment. Him and
Lee Winnell.
One other guy. Which one? Who?
Lee Winnell. He is the guy that also co-wrote the film with him, but he also starred opposite Carrie Elways in the first Saw.
Yeah, it was... Saw was another one kind of like The Conjuring that was a low-budget movie for the most part. The Conjuring was a super low-budget movie. But he was... people don't remember it because Saw is kind of, mainstream-wise, kind of turned into a joke. You get a new Saw every year, and it's like, oh, another Saw. Let's see how they can kill people now. But since then, he's built off of it, especially when he did Conjuring and started the whole Conjuring universe and series and built his name off horror. But I think the original Saw and Insidious kind of fell behind because of how big those other franchises got.
When you talk about budget-wise, I mean, Lee Winnell and James Wan were fresh out of film school making this little indie film called Saw. And originally, Saw is kind of one of those things that it premiered at Sundance and kind of had this Blair Witch effect on some of the filmmakers, and it kind of really ushered in this whole new subgenre of horror, which has been, over the last couple decades, has been dubbed torture porn. And so this is just a really grotesque display of blood and guts, and let's just see how gory and how messy we can truly make this. And for me, like, I really enjoy these films. I enjoy Saw as one of my favorite franchises, and it's one of my favorite series to always come back to every few years, simply because of its serialized story format. And over James Wan aside, like, obviously they just set out to make this a one-off kind of film, and the studio Twisted Pictures kind of saw how marketable this was, and then he had, like, they just kind of turned it into what it became. And you're right, kind of like it does become a joke, and like there are people, it's very divisive. You either really love that series as a whole or you really hate it. And you need a strong stomach in order to do it. But then he kind of went off and did other things like Dead Silence, which I'm going to talk about a lot on this podcast, because this film, to me, *Malignant*, feels a lot like Dead Silence, where it was something that just kind of really caught me off left guard. It blends a whole lot of genres. The comedy in it is really subtle, but I think it's often, that particular picture is often overshadowed in everything else, because Insidious went on to become its own miniature franchise. The Conjuring spawned off a whole different universe that gave us not only the Conjuring trilogy, but also gave us an Annabelle trilogy and a Nun hat, a Nun film, which I'm wearing the Nun hat right now. That's why I said that. And then you've also, they're also developing other pictures on, like, another Nun movie is being developed right now. They're doing a Crooked Man. So, like, they have so many more stones in the fire, so to say, for the Conjuring film universe. And then he also has done these, like, really weird big budget films like Aquaman and Furious 7, and to those that know of it, Death Sentence with Kevin Bacon. It's a great example, and you know, he's kind of really gotten a chance to explore a lot of those things. But I feel like so many people now, if you're into horror, you know him from The Conjuring, and if you're into action, you know him from Aquaman.
Yeah, he kind of, like we said a little earlier, he made his name in horror directly, um, starting with the original Saw. And he just kind of built off of it. I don't know if doing some of the other movies that he did, like one of the Fast and Furious, apparently he was involved in the MacGyver TV series that they did over the last couple of years.
Weird. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was executive producer for the MacGyver TV series and for the Swamp Thing series.
I didn't know about Swamp Thing.
Do what?
I did know about Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing, I really wish that they would have done more with, because he's also given us, and one of the things too that he's also done is also given us fresh voices within horror, and Swamp Thing is a great example about that, because that show was showrun by Gary Dauberman, who wrote a couple of the Conjuring movies. I know that he also had a hand in writing the 2 It movies that we got recently. And he is just kind of a fresh voice that I really appreciate in horror, but also Lee Winnell as well.
It seems like every 10 or 20 years we get one of those names that's just synonymous with horror, like John Carpenter and who's the other one? I can't remember off the top of my head.
Wes Craven?
For some reason. Yeah, Wes Craven. My brain decided to shut off. But yeah, we get somebody like that every so often, every 10 or 20 years. And James Wan seems to be falling into that category. They do other stuff here and there, but for the most part, it's all horror all the time.
I would argue against that, simply because at my core, and I've established this several times over, I love horror, and horror is my favorite genre of movies to watch. It's my favorite genre of books to read, but also at the same time, like at the end of the day, like I am still going to be a cinephile, and that means that I'm going to love other genres of movie and love the medium as a whole. And I feel like to understand, and I feel like Malignant is a great example of just kind of the scope of which Wan has directed over the years and how his filmography has really changed. I'm going to talk about this, and some of the positives that I really enjoyed about this film is there are certain sequences within Malignant that you can see that he's picked up along the way from the action side of things that he's directed in Death Sentence, in Furious 7, and Aquaman. Like, these are 3 huge budget films that, I digress on Death Sentence. Death Sentence by this point is largely forgotten about. It's kind of one of those gems, and when he was still trying to make a name for himself really early in his career. If you know about Death Sentence, it's a fun time. It's a really great film. But then you look at the Furious 7, which went on to make $1 billion. I believe it might even still be the highest grossing Fast and Furious film that we've gotten. And Aquaman. Aquaman also grossed $1 billion by itself. It is often pointed to as one of the highlights of the DCEU. And I feel like for him, he's definitely... And then getting into like other things like executive producing, not even looking at other things he's done. But the majority of his career is horror, but he has dabbled in other genres, and I feel like the dabbling that he has done in other genres, he brings really great sequences into Malignant from that experience.
Yeah, and when you look at Aquaman, it falls into a category of the DC movies that are without Zack Snyder, and they have tended to be the better of the DC movies, or at least in a lot of people's opinions. Maybe not yours, because I know you like the Zack Snyder stuff, but
yeah,
for some strange reason. But the stuff that didn't have Snyder, and Aquaman happened to be one of them, tended to be overall better accepted and made more money overall, and Aquaman was one of those. the action in Malignant, the like fight scenes that they had were interesting, and I could see where he might have pulled from his experience with other franchises outside of horror, because you typically wouldn't get that kind of a fight scene in a horror movie, or at least not like it was done here. But yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, so let's dive into kind of our spoiler-free thoughts on *Malignant*. And if you guys, we'll give a spoiler warning, but the movie is now streaming on HBO Max as of this recording, and it's also playing in theaters as of this recording. But let's go ahead and jump into this. What did you think of this movie?
Overall, I liked it. It felt a touch commercialized. It felt more like a Hollywood horror than like he used to do. And it might have just been from some of the effects that were used and some of the shots that he used. But it's good overall. We really enjoyed it. My wife watched it with me, and she loved it. She thought it was great. My daughter watched it at the same time. They both really like the bad guy. So that was a cool concept that they had. So it's a good one overall. It's a better one within the last few years to come out.
I think I'm going to be on the opposite end of you throughout the rest of this podcast moving forward. Just for listeners, we haven't talked about this at all. I haven't shared any of my thoughts online. Mark and I haven't talked about this prior to us actually recording, and I'm going to go a little
disagree a lot.
Sometimes. I think The Wicker Man's a great example of kind of where we meet within one another. But I really thoroughly enjoyed this movie. I had zero idea what this movie was about. I hadn't seen any trailers. I know that we were talking one night after we had gotten done recording one of the other episodes, and you had brought it up, and I was like, yeah, it's like, I haven't seen anything for it. We can do an episode, and that was just kind of that. And all day yesterday leading up to going to see it in the theaters, like, my body was just like, I was constantly like, man, I'm so ready for this. Like, what's this about? And I pretty much at this point will go see anything that says either from producer or from director James Wan, as I've previously established. I am looking very, very much forward to I Know What You Did Last Summer in a couple of weeks on Amazon. But with this one specifically, I think that what you get is something that feels like a return to form for him. I feel like we haven't kind of seen this James Wan in a really long time. As far as storytelling goes, I brought up Dead Silence earlier, and this film kind of feels like Dead Silence to me. It feels like a precursor to that film, or that it could exist in that film. I do see where you're coming from, and kind of talking about how it's commercialized a little bit. It feels a little bit overproduced. Some of the fight sequences in this, that while I still enjoyed them, I can definitely kind of see that they're very polished, and they kind of feel off tone from the rest of the film. But overall, like, I really thoroughly enjoyed this movie.
Yeah, it's. I'm not saying it was a bad movie or distracting. It had that Hollywood shine to it, like you get with a lot of movies when they throw you a budget, as opposed to Saw just had that grit and grime that you get with a low budget horror, and the fighting that was done, the action scenes. The only reason I bring it up is because it left me without getting into spoilers, it kind of left me wondering, how did they know that? How did they learn to fight like it? There was no basis for how the creature was fighting, if that makes sense.
No, you're absolutely right, and there are a couple of goofs that I caught in that regards too, that I'll talk about when we get into the spoiler section. But this film, so I brought up we've been talking about kind of his budgets over the years and what he's been able to do with budgets. And so Saw is this really simple concept. It's two guys in a room for 90% of the movie. Everything else is kind of shot on like location, like police precincts, in apartments. Like that's basically the simplicity of Saw. That's what I feel like makes it so effective. Is it was a film that was budgeted at $1.2 million, and then you start getting into some of his other films. I brought up Dead Silence. Dead Silence and Conjuring both had a $20 million budget, and Insidious was kind of a return to form for him because it only had a $1.5 million budget, which blows my mind. But I think that you can definitely kind of see it, a lot of the shine to this one, and I feel like a large portion of that comes from the film's like rich cinematography. That, not saying that it's a necessarily a bad thing, it's just kind of something that feels a tad out of place. Like there are things in here that just don't feel like they belong, and that's because you have the budget, which is really weird to a thing to kind of complain about, because
because you either want one or the other. You either want that low budget feel, which is part of what made The Conjuring great, is I believe there was little to no computer effects. It was all practical effects. I can't remember a scene in the original Conjuring, and that's part of how they kept the budget so low. The original Saw, was low budget too, and everything was practical effects. There was no CG, and they both had that feel to it that kind of production brings, and Malignant didn't have that, because some of the effects that they use in it, you can see are very obviously computer and a lot of polish and editing and things like that.
Yeah, so I feel like because this film is so like fresh into theaters, like there's not a whole lot of information that I can find on the actual budget of this film, but you can definitely see, because some of the CGI feels a little bit whack, and I feel like that's kind of like been a staple issue for New Line's like more recent horror that they've done in the last few years. Like when you look at something like from 2017, like that's a great example where that film is so freaking good, and the lowest points of that movie are just the really grotesque and really embarrassing CGI that film has.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes from the fact that right now, what's your big movies? It's the superhero franchises and things like that have ton of computer effects, and then you get thrown a Hollywood backing. What do you do with all this extra budget? Do you stick with your low budget practical effects, or do you spend it to get something kind of flashy? So I think in this case, you added some flashy to it that it didn't distract, but it didn't feel natural to the movie.
Yeah.
So it gives you a weird feel to it.
Also, I'm gonna say that like you look at other films like that Blumhouse makes. Blumhouse has established this reputation for making just super dirt cheap movies, anywhere between $1 to $5 million. I think potentially the most expensive one they have might be $10 million, but like it's just really like dirt cheap, and they've established that they can do that kind of filmmaking really effectively. And so what you have is you have like 85% of the time like really great horror that comes out with like really respectable and commendable box office return because of how cheap it is. But I would dare say that you couldn't do that with this one because of the supernatural elements. There has to be some level of budget involved.
Yeah, the way they worked out the, I guess, reveal of what and who the bad guy is, I'm not sure it would have been possible to do a traditional effect. And it gave a lot of gloss and shine in some shots that ended up almost being unreadable at times to the character's face. And that kind of bothered me.
See, I would dare say that, and this is going to be the last thing we'll talk about before we get into spoilers. I would dare say that you could achieve the character design of the villain with practical effects. And I feel like it would have made it a little bit more effective and grotesque had you taken that route. But given the fact that this is a big budget, not a big budget, but a major studio release, I don't think you're going to get that. And that's really a shame. I feel like there are some things working against this movie that is actually unable to kind of see it, but it's very far and few between. I feel like the characters, the twists and the turns and the narrative, like it's weird enough and it's rich enough in its character content and how it's paced that it more than makes up for it. I feel like
it's not. We're sitting here talking, and people might get the idea that we didn't like it or we're trashing it. It's a good movie overall. It had some of those issues that some of the bigger Hollywood releases have, where they relied too much in certain scenes on computer instead of doing something traditional to give it a more believable feel. Like, you look at the was it 1980 Thing? Everything was a traditional effect, and it was such a better movie than was it 2011, 2012 Thing that was a prequel. And part of the issue with it was that the studios pushed for them to use computer effects to have more animated and flashier monsters than the 1980 version had. And that's the problem that Malignant had, was the few scenes that they had, and they could have used traditional effects to make it more believable and real. They used computer, which kind of was a distraction.
I will agree, but I will also say that the computer effects were not the sole thing that was wrong with the 2011 Thing movie. Let's just put that out there.
I mean, I liked the 2011 Thing, but a lot of people didn't. But it in no way was as good as 1981.
All right. Well, let's give our ratings real quick. We'll take a commercial break and then come back and talk about spoilers. Mark, where on the Rorschach rating scale would you place Malignant?
3.5.
Oh, okay. I see you. I'm going to go a little bit further, and I'm actually going to give this a 4.5. God, I love this movie so much. I'm just going to say that.
So it takes a lot for me to put a movie outside of that 3.5, 3 rating, because so many movies have a lot of almost reused and generic feel to them. But there's some originality to Malignant. It's just that lack of traditional effects and the kind of big budget feel it had is what kind of brings it to 3.5 instead of like a 4 or 4.5 to me.
Sure. And so, like, I guess, like, being almost 2 months into these, like, indie film festivals, because we both just got off of Fantasia Fest, and I had just covered Genre Blast and Creature Feature, which you guys can hear our Creature Feature. Make sure that you guys subscribe to us, our parent company, Victims and Villains, on YouTube. Make sure that you guys can hear our thoughts and what movies to watch out for from this year's Genre Blast. But a lot of those are all DIY, like, super low budget indie movies, and some of them, like, look really nice. But for me, like, I also, like, I guess it doesn't bother me that this kind of looks like it's a little bit stylized in the way that some of the way that it's like shot or delivered, because to me I feel like the story itself is compelling enough to kind of make me overlook a lot of that stuff. So yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's just the difference in point of view we have on them.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back with spoilers.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now, and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Welcome back to Abyss Gazing. If you guys are just joining us, we're getting ready to jump into the spoilers, because much like the relationship between Emily and Gabriel, you can't talk about this movie without doing spoilers. So I'm just going to jump in here real quick, and this is your official spoiler warning. I teased this before the commercial break. There is a goof, a filming goof that stands out to me so much about this movie, and it got under my skin so freaking much. So in the first act, Emily, who is actually Emily is revealed to be her real name later on, but her real name in this movie is Natty. That's how we're introduced to her, and she's pregnant. And there's a scene and an altercation that happens between Maddie and her husband. And
was it husband or boyfriend?
I'm pretty sure it was her husband, because they talk about how there's a line in the movie that she basically talks about how Madison was the name that they gave you, but the crappy marriage that you were in gave you the name Mitchell. So Gabriel's kind of talking to her. The first interaction that they have is basically like the importance of like her names and kind of like where she had. But there's a scene where like after that altercation happens, she locks herself away in her room and she's pregnant. And there's a scene where we're first introduced to to Gabriel, and she lifts up the covers. And I don't know why I noticed this, but this is the first time I've ever noticed this in a movie. I'm so proud of myself. The scene where, so it focuses on her getting out of the bed, and her, her fake, belly tummy is actually shifted completely to the right of her entire torso. I don't know if you caught that, but I was just like, that's not right. And it just looked like they left it in, because all of her body is shifting left, and her pregnant belly is just completely right. It's almost like in the center of her body. It's kind of embarrassing.
So I missed that, but I didn't catch that. However, is it possible it was on purpose when they later talk about Gabriel and show Gabriel with arms bending in the wrong direction, thumbs on the wrong side of the hand, stuff like that? Could that have possibly been intentional, considering what you find out later?
I would argue no, simply because of the fact of just like that revelation, like it potentially, I mean, you could be 100% right, and when I go back and watch this on subsequent viewings, I could be totally eat my words, but I will say probably not, at least in my thought process, because it just looked like someone like just edited stuff like really poorly, or like no one caught that.
Like a sitcom or something, you get a camera boom mic in the scene or something like that.
Yeah, so there's actually a scene in and I think probably one of the more famous ones, in one of the Lord of the Rings, there's actually a scene where one of the extras actually comes up too soon after a battle, like he's supposed to be playing dead, and he like lifts up, and every time we watch those movies, my wife always points it out to me.
Did you ever catch the scene in Fellowship of the Ring where they're going through like the farm or field or whatever, and you could see the road in the background?
No.
Driving by.
No, I didn't.
One of my favorite shows ever, Frasier, there's a scene where the dog trainer for Moose, otherwise known as Eddie in the show, you can see him giving hand signals on the side of the screen.
Interesting. I think this. So this movie, *Malignant*. Let's just talk about this. It sounds like a horror movie, and it's one of the things that I love so much about this movie. Like I said before the commercial break, I hadn't watched any trailers, didn't know anything about this movie, and *Malignant* just sounds so grotesque and so dirty. And I love the fact that this movie is called *Malignant*. But I think one of the things that we talked about earlier was just the way that some of the scenes are stylized. Like, you have those like action sequences, and there's two sequences in particular that I think this film does really well when it comes to that kind of stuff. Is there's a scene where where Maddie's actually walking throughout her home, and it's just an aerial shot. I don't know how you felt about that, but like I really loved it. It's like a very simplistic kind of view, but it's just very effective. And then once the climax of all the revelations of Maddie and Emily actually being Gabriel, I felt like the scene of her in like the just destroying all of like the inmates within that holding cell was a really well done shot. And then the scene where it's like super stylized, but it's the scene where it's like him against all of the cops. I thought that was marvelous.
That was a cool concept. I like the way they did that. Like I said, I was watching it with my daughter and my wife, and they both, in the prison scene, they thought that was awesome. It was cool. I thought it was a little cheesy, but it was still cool.
Well, I feel like I appreciated it just the way that the camera flowed throughout those scenes, is that it felt like an extension of her character, and in the police scene, it felt like an extension of his character. The way that they were just able to move, it was very fast-paced. It kind of almost felt like the best comparison I can make it to is it felt like the way that the action sequences in Crank are, just shot like super quick and but like also like really effective.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. And I know that's what it sounds like sometimes, me talking about it. It was good. It was just, And that gets into what I said earlier about how does Gabriel know how to fight in this manner? It's almost like a style of martial arts, as opposed to some monster that's just fighting out of sheer brutality. Some of the things he does and ways he moves and action used felt like some sort of very rough martial arts more than anything else. I'm like, how does Gabriel know that if he's part of the girl and she's never trained in any of this stuff?
How did you feel about that twist actually being revealed later on in the movie?
That he was a cancer?
That he was an extension of of her, but he was also this had they put it like this fully operational almost tumor is how they described it.
It's a type of tumor. I forgot the actual name for it, but it's a tumor that when they take it out, it ends up having like hair and teeth and all kinds of stuff. And this was like supposedly a really advanced version of that tumor that was essentially a twin almost. Yeah, it's kind of like this like conjoined twin aspect that they brought to it, which
so for me, actually watching it, I was kind of like, okay, we've never seen, I feel like, at least in horror, I've never seen something, with the exception of the two dead twins from The Shining. I've never seen a centralized story in the horror genre about twins. And I felt like that they were going to use that whole, twin telepathy concept that so many people talk about in movies, or at least more comedies, I guess. But I was not expecting it to take the twist where it's like, oh no, she's actually not only he's not actually only a repressed memory, but also he's kind of almost bordering conjoined twin area.
Yeah, and that was kind of, I don't know, it was an interesting concept. But once they show what all Gabriel could do, you kind of wonder, how come her arms aren't hurting from bending in that direction? That's not natural. These are some of the thoughts I had watching this movie was, okay, if Gabriel is... what was her name? Emily, Madison, whatever. Madison. If that's her, but in reverse, basically, because whenever Gabriel would make his appearance, she'd tear open the back of her head and his face would come out, where you found out they removed all of Gabriel but the portion where they were connected at the brain. They just cut open the skull and basically shoved it in there and put a piece of skull over top of it. And whenever Gabriel would make his appearance, she would walk backwards. The elbows would bend in reverse sometimes. I don't know if you noticed that. Mm-hmm. And the thumbs, instead of pointing up, were pointing down, which would mean that essentially, let's see. Yeah, so she's hyperextending joints. Why doesn't she hurt after all of this?
So,
and for some odd reason, I know it's make believe and it's supernatural horror, but that really bothered me.
So you look to other films in the supernatural genre, you look to most famously the Exorcist, where one of the most famous sequences in that entire film is actually cut from the movie, but it's the spider walk that Linda Blair's character does. Yeah. And I feel like, to me, I didn't actually, it didn't disassociate it for me, simply because I'm like, okay, this film is clearly a amalgamation of the supernatural horror that we've come to know Wan for in the Conjuring and Insidious movies. And so he's taking kind of almost like an exorcist approach to the relationship between Emily and Gabriel, it kind of almost feels like that Reagan Pazuzu type relationship where, but instead of like, just kind of getting progressively worse like Reagan does, this one consistently actually goes and gets kind of they just bounce off each other, and they're able to come and go under will. And I think that in some stories, whether you're talking about fictional or what, I would believe to some degree are, true, stories of demonic possession, there are times where demons can manifest, just kind of almost at will and share the host before it eventually gets worse. And I think that once the twist happens, that's what you see take place. And it's a large portion of what you're seeing actually taking place is the fact that kind of Gabriel has reached that Pazuzu state to where he's no longer sharing anymore, but he is learning how to take over the host fully.
Well, you bring up the supposed real life instances of possession, and what ends up happening after the quote unquote exorcism is some of the contorted positions and movements that these people make. They end up with fractured, broken bones, torn ligaments, and things like that from the contorted positions they ended up in. So kind of leads me back to with certain movements that Gabriel was making. How was she like, oh, my head's bleeding and that's the worst I've got after every incident?
I mean, there's a number of different things that you can kind of say to that. And, I think that to your point about, real life possession, I think a lot of the stories that we see come out of that, specifically like Wondery just did a great podcast series called Inside the Exorcist, where it really deconstructs a lot of the stories that inspired that film, and also kind of like the success and impact it had on the general population and subsequent horror genre. I feel like, to your point specifically about real life, is that you're always going to have some kind of a remnant left over. And I think that is long term. I feel like you don't really see a lot of that stuff happen until months later. Like I feel like it is kind of almost like my wife works in chiropractic, and the way she talks about it is that like if you have like a car accident at say 19 years old and you don't, like, it doesn't feel like anything, like you feel fine, but you go untreated, chances are you're going to have a lot of those scars, or a lot of that impact isn't going to show up until 5 to 10 years later, and you could seriously mess up, your spine, your back, your shoulders, your neck muscles. Like, there's a number of different variations that one experience can have on you. And I think that I would argue, as a practicing Christian and believer in demonic possession, that's kind of almost the same way, is that you're not going to see some of those effects until years later.
Maybe I'm just being too picky. I don't know. But it was just one of those things. It was like, what? So, yeah, it is what it is, I guess.
I feel like this film, too, to kind of get into a little bit more of the discussion on its themes and its use of mental health, I feel like this film does a lot with the Maddie Emily character. I want to say / Gabriel, like, I don't know, but this idea of when we first meet this character, here you have someone that is just dealing so consistently with the gravity of loss, and is just constantly, almost feels like that you're just meeting her constantly in this like state of grief, because the film does note that when we meet her, she's pregnant for the 3rd time following 2 miscarriages, and I feel like it handles that loss really well, but then you kind of get to see that develop a little bit later in the film when the big reveal is actually done, that here you have a woman that has repressed memories, but also on top of that, she is kind of grieving the loss of those memories. She is grieving the loss of this life that she knew to be legitimately real. And through the hypnotist scene, you kind of get to see that a lot of what she has believed was real still is real, but you have 8 years of your life that you just don't remember. And those themes of loss, I feel like Wan does really well in here.
Yeah, and then you added the fact that she's an abuse victim on top of that. The boyfriend or husband, whatever her name was, or whatever his relationship was to her, was abusive as hell. And actually, you could tie the whole movie back to him because he was the one that freed Gabriel anyways. But yeah, you add that in on top of it, and she's just almost, in a constant state of depression the whole movie.
Well, let's talk about that. I know for myself, the few times that I've experienced loss in my life, and I feel like I've gone through that spiraling depression, and I have 3 tattoos in memory of my grandmother. I was very close to her, and I lost her also at a very I don't want to say young age, but younger age. So, but all of 90% of my childhood memories are with her. And so here you have this feeling of loss and of grief and just anger and resentment and bitterness that I dealt with for years. And I feel like there's so many different emotions that loss can trigger depending on, the type of loss that you've experienced. And, we're talking quite literally being close to someone in the sense of losing someone that you spend so much time with, the way that Maddie has spent time with this unborn daughter, and also the other two miscarriages that she's experienced within this 2-year time frame. And then you have loss. I've shared it many times, but the reason that I got started doing mental health awareness was because I lost a friend to suicide. And suicide is kind of one of those losses that it feels incredibly powerless and helpless. And I feel like at the same time, those are some of the things that you get to see Maddie endure. There's a point in the film where it just kind of, there's a scene in particular where she's actually having a conversation with Gabriel in this just black room, and there's just the sense of helplessness that and hopelessness that she endures to kind of ultimately come out on top. But I mean, still, you're still having to go through that and interact with that. And I feel like there's so many different emotions that death or grief can yield you, and I feel like this film explores a lot of those really well.
It does. I know we had mentioned in an earlier episode, I had a uncle that died earlier this year, and I just recently went to a funeral with a friend that his wife died of cancer. She was 36. And I've also talked about that it's a topic that's a little, I guess, odd for me, simply because you were talking about how you deal with it and things like that. And the way I view it is that it happens. It's a natural part of life and this and that. And I really don't have much to say on it because it's hard for me to almost relate to what you're saying, I guess.
And that's fine, but I would even deconstruct what you're saying, particularly when you're talking about the families that are impacted every day by suicide, and say that that's not a natural part of life, because the whole reason that Victims and Villains exist, and that's High Praise and Abyss Gazing and so many of the other projects that we're doing, is to bring awareness of people's value and worth. And while I will agree with you, like there are definitely natural parts of death that I've gone through and I've grieved and I've been okay with. At the same time, like I still feel like there are deaths that happen every day that don't have to happen, like overdoses, suicides, car accidents. There's a number of different reasons that you can kind of talk about that would come against essentially what you're talking about as far as death being a natural part of life.
Right. And that's kind of, there's always a way to work through those things, but at the same time, it's an issue that people that have actually gone through with it may not see those outlets, may not understand that they exist, or may not see that they exist, or even feel that it would help them. And that is the part that makes it different than, like, my uncle, who essentially was just old age and medical conditions, but in like a suicide or something like that, it's people that feel helpless and nothing's going to help them. And they choose that route instead of finding some way to deal with it and cope.
But there is hope, and that's the, I feel like the reason that we kind of come and do these podcasts week in and week out is because we want to encourage people that, hey, we're going to have these conversations on films and comic books and animes or whatever, but at the end of the day, like, we just want you to know that you have value and that you have worth. And I feel like so much, and having been someone that has gone through depression, having been somebody that has gone through and understood those pains of, no one understands, because depression has this way of just making you feel like you're alone, like to your point, like that you don't matter, you don't have value, none of those resources that are available are actually going to make any difference. But I would challenge you, and we talked about this with I want to say one of the filmmakers from Genre Blast that you guys will get to hear in subsequent weeks, is that, just flip your perspective. And I know that sounds really, really easy to do, but, find something that you can hold on to. We've talked about this in previous episodes, where it's like, okay, like, I'm gonna hold fast and look forward to next Tuesday, because there's a movie coming out on Blu-ray that I've been wanting to see for a while, or I'm going to hold off until next Wednesday because I'm getting a new puppy, or there's so many different things that you can do. And depression, again, sucks. Depression is a liar, because it kind of gives you this warped sense of how the world is. And I feel like, to bring it back to Malignant, there's a sense of that she feels within kind of being trapped in this relationship, being cut off from her sister and the rest of her family, because they do note that Derek, who was her husband, actually didn't want her to have any contact with Sydney. So, like, Sydney's having this revelation of the 3 miscarriages in the moment with the police officer, and doesn't really kind of know. And also another form of kind of leaving depression behind and kind of learning how to operate and taking steps to walk out of it is finding the right people that you can also be with, and finding the right people that are going to provide a healthy outlet and encourage your growth walking out of depression.
And I mean, as simple as it sounds, if you're in that state, what do you have to lose by trying something that might help?
I think to bring it back to, to what I've gone through in my own life with depression, is that depression has this way of really just, it sounds so cheesy to say, but being an outlet for shame, because it just feels like no one else is going to notice, and like that you're kind of almost doomed to walk in that or to live in that headspace. And so like, also it's really hard things to talk about, and it's really hard things to have conversations on. So you have to initially not only get over that mindset of what do I have to lose and to live in that, but also to understand that somebody is actually going to understand what you're going through. Someone is going to confirm that you're not alone, and that they're going to be healthy enough to, kind of shepherd you through to recovery.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but it still comes down to the personal choice. Do I want to choose to use what's available to me or not? And if you look at it more as a way of, I mean, I'm already at a low. What do I have to lose by talking to a therapist or a friend or something? They may not understand, but you might be able to get some advice that could help, or the outlet itself might help you. It's different from person to person too, so.
It does. You're 100% right. It is 100% does come down to the person. I think there is a level of vulnerability that we need to, I don't want to say provide for these types of situations, but you have to be willing to talk about and address these things, because that's honestly going to be the real way that you're going to grow. I shared this with our staff last year, that when the height of the pandemic was going on, like, we moved from where we were in Pennsylvania to where we are in Virginia now, and kind of like just packing everything up and moving, while it has done wonders for my mental health, and just also at the same time, like, it was really hard to kind of acknowledge, why am I feeling this way? And I struggled for months before I actually opened up to a lot of you guys and said, hey, like, I just want to apologize for, like, if I've come across like rude or just like immature or just a number of different things. Like, I've been going through depression, and it didn't dawn on me until recently. And so I think that a large portion of that, what you're going through, also, you have to acknowledge it, and you kind of also have to understand, for lack of a better word, what it is, and be okay to talk about it.
I mean, with as personal as different issues can be, and thinking that, oh, no one gets it, no one's going to understand, at the same time, what seems to, I guess, not really occur in the thought process is that other people have been through different similar situations with their own personal twists. So as much as you feel like it's no one understands, it's part of the depression telling you that, as opposed to the reality that, yes, other people have been through very similar instance and situations, just with their own almost personal touch to it. So that's one of the things that is often overlooked.
Yeah, depression kind of almost feels like an art form, to where, like, it's one of those things that, like, we're here talking about Malignant, right? And so like you have your own view of the film and what makes it good and what makes it bad, and then I have the completely opposite thing, and I interpret it completely different. It's like the equivalent of standing in an art museum and two people from two completely walks of life are looking at a painting and saying, oh, I see a clown in this one, and the other person says, oh, well, I see a guy and walking his dog. Like just two completely different things. And I think that depression a lot of times is the same exact way, to where people are never, 9 times out of 10, might not ever have the same exact experience. But we can look to statistics, we can look to, advocacy, and realize that you're not alone. That there are, I think the last time I checked, it was like 17 million confirmed cases of adults in the United States that have been diagnosed with depression. And then you also look to things like the suicide statistics that we gave earlier in the show, that as of this recording, there's 132 suicides that take place every day. There's 800,000 that take place internationally every year. That's one death roughly every 40 seconds. And so all of these things say that while the experiences might not be the same, that you're not alone.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that to kind of bring it back to Malignant, a lot of like there's a point in the film where the big reveal is done, where you find out that Gabriel and Emily are one and the same, like they're conjoined twins, which, complaints about the effects aside, I think that the practical effect of Gabriel attached to her was actually pretty well done. I don't know about you.
I'm still not sure how I felt about that. I kept having an old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie reference the whole time once they revealed that. It's a tumor. It's not a tumor. It's a tumor. So I might have been my own worst distraction for that point.
Fair enough.
But I'm not quite sure how I felt about that. That it's just a smart tumor, essentially, because they make a point to point out that it was not a conjoined twin.
Yeah, but I bring up that scene in particular to address the fact of there's a line that one of the characters gives where it's basically, I want to say it's Dr. Foster. She says that Gabriel essentially is mentally imprisoning Emily. And I feel like that's such a great allegory for depression, is that depression has this very muted way of looking at life, and it looks at it through this kind of almost mental prison that we eventually see Gabriel kind of trapped into later in the movie. And Yeah, I don't know. But you kind of see how that mental prison has really affected Madison / Emily throughout the remainder of the film following that. And then when you kind of step back and you look at her character arc through the entire film, here you have a almost kind of like a Stockholm Syndrome film type of relationship that she has with Derek, where he is abusive. He is a recovering alcoholic, and he also basically dictates who she can and cannot talk to. So you have just this really toxic relationship that is also feeding this girl that is going through a depression that is, later revealed to kind of go through not only the loss of her child, but the loss of her, abuser. And yes, I would say that, like, even it's weird because I've never lost anyone. I've never been abused. I've never been I've been in some relationships, romantically speaking, that were probably not the best for me, as I've shared in previous episodes before. And I would imagine that there's some level of both relief and grief that you're feeling simultaneously as that person dies, because you've spent so much of your life with her, with that individual. I don't know, like how would you kind of classify, or would you say that, like, it also feels like grief for her, kind of losing both the baby and the husband the same night?
You know what? I don't know. I can tell you from the abusive relationship point of view that yes, it's a relief and almost like a weight lifted. I can tell you that. The other, I don't know.
That's fair. And I guess, like, we're both coming at this from, like, just the experience of not going through that, not enduring that. And I guess, like, for me, like, I'm just looking at this from the standpoint of, you've spent so long with these people, but then you see other stories. Like, one of the films we covered earlier this year was Stronger and Pretty, that told it was a biopic that basically told the story of this abusive marriage that a kid watched endure, and kind of like what happened after the woman broke free. And so I think to a degree that, like, there is that level of relief there that you're not going to feel it, but I don't know, it's such a weird and, like, gray area, because I, like, to your point, like, neither one of us can really speak on it.
I mean, the one aspect I can, the other I can't. Yeah. So that's why I say I can tell you from my standpoint, the abusive relation standpoint, it's almost like a weight lifted.
It is. And so I guess like, tweet to us, and, like, if you guys are feeling comfortable enough, kind of share your experiences, because that's kind of an insight that I would much value, and kind of get to see a large portion of this. I guess the last thing I really wanted to talk about is kind of stepping back into the horror of this movie, and talking about the way that it blends genres together. We've talked about previously how this film uses a lot of the supernatural elements, but it's also a slasher film at its core. And I wanted to know how you felt about the blending of those two genres together.
Okay, so when you see Maddie kind of having her, I guess, vision or whatever of what's going on, did you notice that it was almost like a Silent Hill reference? If you know what I'm talking about.
I didn't, and I've only ever seen Silent Hill, and I've never played any of the games.
Oh, you poor man.
Yeah,
the games are fantastic.
That's my
1,
reference
2,
point.
and 3 are fantastic. So when she would start having her visions, the way the walls would kind of melt away and walls be revealed, that was totally the first time they show that, I was like, dude, that's Silent Hill. This has a Silent Hill reference to it. And some of I don't even know that it was intentional. Some of the way that Gabriel moved and acted and some of the things that happened with Gabriel was totally like, dude, he must have played Silent Hill at some point. Or it was just coincidental. I don't know. But I picked up what seemed to be a head full of Silent Hill references and influences.
Also, I'm going to say this too, as I've established, I really, really love Dead Silence. I feel like it's probably the most underrated film in James Wan's filmography, just because it's largely overshadowed by Saw and Insidious. I feel like those two movies right there are talked about so much more. But I am going to say that I really, really, truly love that film, and maybe one day we'll eventually cover it on here. But I don't know if you caught this, but like there's a scene where he is talking, Detective K is talking, and he answers his phone, and he says his full name, and it didn't dawn on me until like the third time he said it, but I was like, his last name is Shaw. As in
Hobbs?
Mary Shaw from Dead Silence.
Oh, yeah. Gotcha.
Like, I was just like, I was the only person in the theater, thank God, and I just was like, that light bulb clicked for me, and I just made like this like huge audible noise in the theater, and I was just like, man, like, I've gained such a finer appreciation for this movie.
Well, he makes references off and on to his other movies in other movies that he does. And it's one of those things where if you're paying attention, you catch it if you're familiar with his work. And that's probably what that was, is just where he was making a reference. I think, was it Insidious? There's like a little drawing on the board in the on like the whiteboard or whatever in the background, and it's a reference to Saw. It's either got the spiral or the little jigsaw puppet face, one or the other.
There's actually also, to bring that up, there's a scene in Death Sentence that actually has Billy the puppet graffitied on a wall. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, his films that he works on, he makes references to other films that he's worked on. The most easiest to spot are in the Conjuring series. You see in Annabelle Creation, they show the little music box that shows up in the original Conjuring. They show a photo of the nun that has Valak kind of in the background. Things like that. It's more common to notice and pick up on in the Conjuring series, like I said, but he does show like little background references to other movies that he's done.
Yeah, but anyways, coming back to this film, I think, so the first death that we experience in this movie is the lead doctor at Simeon, and she is killed by a trophy for something in excellence or in her field, or like being like the best surgeon or something along those lines. Because it's later established that she is basically a doctor that specializes in like children or child like plastic surgery. And so a thing that I really enjoyed about this film is specifically about the gags in it, is the fact that here you have a character that I was really disappointed when he kills her with the blunt object, like the blunt part of it, and I was like, man, like I was waiting for her to be stabbed. And then the very next scene is like, oh, half of it's missing. And I loved the fact that it takes the time to actually show us like how he crafts the weapon and then uses it later. Like it's almost kind of like a slasher origin story that I feel like operates really well in like the same vein as like Halloween 2007.
Yeah, it's a touch slasher, it's a touch supernatural, it's a touch monster movie. It's kind of got its influences of all of them, really, because you've got the psychic and crazy aspects of the way Gabriel operates, the slasher aspects, and the way that he kills, and then you have the monster movie when you figure out what he actually is. It makes kind of a lot of nods to a lot of different genres of horror.
But I feel like the creature feature aspect of this movie is very kind of like underplayed because of the use of like shadows. Like you don't really get a clear image of who Gabriel is until after the twist has already been revealed and she's in the holding cell.
Yeah, and even then it doesn't have a true creature feature feel, simply because of the human aspects of the character, the way the character moves, talk, when it does talk, things like that. It's got the creature feature feel, but it doesn't at the same time. I don't know. It did, but it didn't. And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, kind of lost the feel a little bit with the way they did some of the special effects for Gabriel just being this little half monster face sticking out of hair in the back of a head, like Voldemort in the first Harry Potter.
God. You just had to bring up Voldemort, didn't you? He who shall not be named.
I love the Harry Potter series. Those are great movies. And books, apparently.
So the last thing I feel like I want to talk about is kind of the way that the film ends ultimately is it's really satisfying because one of the last things that takes place is actually Emily locking Gabriel up to be kind of a repressed memory again, but also at the same time, like she knows that like I am going to know how to deal with you. And a portion of what I think this film does really well to bring it back to our earlier conversation on depression is I feel like, at least in my own life, like I've gone through like severe depression to the point where like I just don't want to live anymore. And I feel like once I took steps to overcome a lot of that stuff, I kind of had that Emily moment where it's like, you might come back up, but I'll know how to deal with you coming forward.
I feel like it was a way to set up doing a sequel at a later date. Oh, Emily has a car wreck and now she's in a coma, but Gabriel's taking over. That's kind of how I felt about the ending. It felt more like a setup to do a sequel if they chose to at a later date.
So, I mean, I really hope this film does not get a sequel because it doesn't need one because it's so good on its own. But I will to bring it back because I just really wanted to end this podcast on a note of encouragement to anyone listening this right now to like it is possible to overcome depression. Like depression doesn't have to be your final stop. And like we've talked about, like there's going to be different things that are going to work for you. I know for my own mental health, a large portion of that has been horror. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes before, it's also been my faith has been a large portion of what has brought me hope. And I know for Mark, a large portion of what has helped him kind of balance his own mental health has been miniature painting. And that's kind of something we explored earlier this year on our parent podcast, Victims and Villains. But I just want to encourage that it is possible not to be left within depression, that there are resources and that there are a plethora of activities and outlets out there that you can overcome and learn how to deal with it, and to also know how to handle it should it come back.
Yeah, there's always some way to find help, whether it's through friends or professional help. There's online resources and in-person resources, and there's always a way to find some sort of way to deal and manage and not just feel like you're getting by, but actually deal with what's going on.
I 100% agree. So we're just going to say this out there, that if you need any resources or need someone to talk to, please consider the resources and the links below wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode, because this is the real reason we make this content, is to be an encouragement and to be an advocate for mental health awareness. But with that, speaking of miniature painting, Mark, where can people find you online?
Titanium Juggernaut Painting on Instagram.
You guys can follow me. I'm on Letterboxd at Captain Nostalgia, and I'm on TikTok at Gents Ghostface. I probably don't make as much content over there as I would like, but you guys can find weird, goofy, horror-themed theories on there. But you guys can follow our parent company, Victims and Villains, at victimsandvillains.net, where you guys can find links to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube, along with movie reviews, podcasts like the ones you're listening to right now, and most importantly, our mental health resource library. I know we've talked about it on Sleepaway Camp, but I promise our next episode is The Stylist.
The Stylist.
So
that was interesting.
Yes, make sure that you guys join us back in 2 weeks, where we'll be talking about The Stylist. But I'm also just going to throw this out there as well. Until next time, remember that the longer you stare into the abyss, the more the monsters stare back. Have a good night.